With that, I just want to say welcome. This is our third Animal Science 1009 class. If you guys do have your video, we encourage you to turn your video on so Steve has the opportunity to interact with you. And so, like right now, Caitlin, are you on?
Yep.
Okay, if you can make, oh, very good, great. We want to see your face. So anyways, and the same with you, Tia. If you have a video, we'd love to see your face. So with that, we're excited that Steve Paisley is with us. He's the, I hope I get this right. He's still the beef specialist located at the research center. He'll correct me if that's wrong now. But anyways, he's been with UW for quite a few years. And so we're excited that he has graciously agreed to teach the nutrition balancing rations section for your Animal Science 1009 class. Just a couple announcements before I turn it over to him is that if you guys, I know Tia is having trouble, but if, Caitlin, you are having complications as far as getting things uploaded in terms of your labs and things like that, please let us know. We do have a couple students that are struggling as far as to get that done. It's not just you, Tia, it's a couple other kids too, so know that. But we encourage you to continue to stay on this. If you've got labs that you can get uploaded, please do those, as well as to keep up on those quizzes on the past 2 lectures. Also, hopefully you've got the next lectures put on your calendars. Those are scheduled for the next, we've got them all for the month of May. So month of May is going to be super busy. The other thing in the month of May is that we are going to offer a couple more labs that will be via Zoom. If you have the opportunity to interact with Dr. Stokes with EWC, we're going to do 2 more of those that hopefully can help you guys get those lab requirements. And then the last announcement before I turn it over to Steve is, if you have not registered to go into the intensive weekend, we really are like 2 weeks away. So please, please, if you're planning on going and have not registered, please get online and get registered so that we can turn in the dorm count and make sure that we get the correct arrangements made with that to make that all happen. If something's happening and you guys need assistance with transportation or things like that, if you let us know, there might be an opportunity, somebody coming from your area that can help transport you guys down there. But it looks like we're going to start at 6 o'clock on Friday night and finish on 4 o'clock on Saturday. The super exciting part is you'll have the opportunity to check off quite a few labs that weekend. So we're excited about having the opportunity to bring you to campus and give you the opportunity to tour and interact with the individuals that are on campus. So with that, I'm just going to ask just a couple that have joined us is the camp houses are on. If you guys could turn on your video, we think that's super helpful so that you can interact and Steve has the opportunity to see you. So the video is not working on camp houses, and then Rebecca, I think it is, just joined us as well. So if Rebecca could turn her video on as well, that would be super helpful. It makes it much easier as the person that's teaching it to have a face to interact with. So the other room looks empty, but I know there's a couple people that are supposed to be coming and joining that back room. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Paisley and let him continue.
Don, I ain't got no video. This is Rebecca.
Is that Rebecca?
Yeah, I don't have a video thing.
Okay, that sounds good. Not a big deal. So it'll work. If you have questions, though, still just pipe in as Steve goes along. So absolutely. Okay. One more reminder, too, is that if you guys have a question that comes up in the middle, is that we're still working on utilizing that chat box. I'll kind of monitor that as well. So if you do have questions as Steve is lecturing, you can absolutely put it in the chat box. And when he gets to the point that it's appropriate that we can ask those questions, that's a great way to answer or ask questions as he's going along as you think of them and maybe you're holding off on the thought. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Paisley.
All right. Thank you very much. Just a second. Let me shut my door. All right. So I was asked tonight to talk to you kind of on a nutrition topic, focusing on ration balancing. And I'll just give you a little background on myself. As we mentioned, Don mentioned, I'm the State Extension Beef Specialist. I'm actually located off campus. I'm located at a research station near Torrington. It's at Lingle, Wyoming. And so I've been a specialist with the university for almost 17 years. And I also teach a beef production class on campus, and I actually teach that part of that class remotely. So I use Zoom quite a bit. I use it on a weekly basis. So we're going to talk about nutrition and ration balancing. And again, if you have any questions, make sure you wave. If you do have a camera, wave at me or speak up, or if you can use the chat box, I'm kind of monitoring the chat box as well. I would encourage you to do that, because these presentations can get long, and the more interaction we have and the more questions, the better off we get along. So I do appreciate everybody that's here and willing to participate, and we'll kind of get going. Let me share my screen here and see if we can get going here. So what I wanted to talk about today is we'll start with nutrition. So again, my background is nutrition, mainly beef cattle nutrition. We'll try and touch base on a number of things. Hopefully for everyone that I know, we probably have more than just beef cattle participating with projects. And so we'll try and address a lot of these different things. And if we have any questions, again, we'll try and address those as we go. So we're going to focus on ration balancing. And I really thought maybe a good way to start is to, we need to talk about basic nutrition first. I think it kind of sets the framework for what we want to discuss or what we want to do later on. So let's just talk a little bit. So what is nutrition? How important? We know it's very important, especially if we have livestock projects. And if we have animals of our own, we focus on nutrition, and we worry about nutrition for those animals. And really, nutrition for us is the science of trying to deal with or utilize food in that animal, for most cases for production purposes. So we want to take in whatever feedstuffs we might have and convert that to gain in the animal, weight gain in the animal, or milk production, or we'll certainly focus on reproduction as well. But we want to use those, make sure we're getting nutrients into the animal for production purposes. So nutrition is that utilization of food for productive reasons, for creating body tissues and producing final products. All right. So why is nutrition important? Really it is. Again, we're trying to utilize feedstuffs, and we want to do that efficiently. And that's kind of the focus of ration balancing tonight, is we can feed almost anything and maybe get an animal will get along, but we want to do it cost effectively. We want that animal to gain weight. We want that animal to be productive. And so in order to do that, we need to balance those nutrients for that animal. Just like we get worried about a balanced diet for ourselves, we need to focus and make sure we get a balanced ration for our animals as well. So we'll talk about that tonight, and I'll give you some ideas. And again, if you have any questions, even later on, make sure you contact all of us, and contact Dawn or any of us, and we can get more information to you if you have additional questions. All right. So we'll focus on, from a nutrition standpoint, that we focus on nutrients. So what are nutrients? What do we need to know about nutrients? And so certainly nutrients are important for the animal. They're basically any single class of food or group of foods that make it possible for an animal to grow or provide or to gain weight, to be productive. So we have essential nutrients that all animals need in order to remain healthy, or in order to remain productive for us. So we just typically talk about, and we want to focus on digestible nutrients. I won't dwell a lot on that slide, but certainly nutrients are important by themselves, but they need to be digestible. They need to be nutrients that animal can absorb, can utilize, and turn into productive tissues, or weight gain, milk production, producing offspring, these types of things. So digestible nutrients are pretty important. So that's the nutrient that can be broken down, absorbed, digested, and utilized by that animal. And when we think about nutrients, this could be a question in a quiz later on, but the main nutrients that we're interested in are those 6 main nutrients that are important to that animal. And we'll kind of go through these individually a little bit here, but certainly we know that those 6 are critical things, the things that we try and balance for in all of our rations. And those main 6 nutrients are protein, carbohydrates, fats, minerals, vitamins, and water. Now I put water at the bottom, but we're going to start with water because water is probably our most important nutrient when it comes to it. So we know that we certainly, that's our probably most concerning nutrient that we have. So water is important for any animals from a production standpoint. And so you'll hear, well, you probably have all along how important water it is, because every time we have a project or we talk about beef quality assurance or livestock quality assurance, any of these things, we always focus on water because again, it's one of our essential nutrients, and it's critical for production. And you know, one way you can see how important that is that certainly our body composition, whether it's us or our livestock animal or anything, is approximately 90% water. So we are a large component of water ourselves. It's important for all of our metabolic processes for normal functioning of our cells. So it's a pretty critical thing. So when we think about water, what things do we focus on? We focus certainly on drinking water, and I've just put some guidelines here as far as how much water an animal needs every day. We talk about, so we'll focus on ration balancing today and developing and balancing rations. Certainly, when we think about rations, it's what that animal requires on a daily basis. And while we may not balance a ration for water, we need to make sure water is provided. Water is pretty critical. I sometimes don't like to provide actual amounts of water because I think it's key that we make it available to the animal at all times. I think that's really key. I think it needs to be clean water. It needs to be palatable water for that animal. And so certainly we have requirements, or we have estimates of how much water an animal will need every day. I think it's more critical to make sure there's adequate water provided at all times. So these are just some examples of how much water is required all the way down. I think that's actually kind of a low estimate on beef cattle, 8 to 16 gallons per day. It can be quite a bit. For especially, we'll talk about in a minute, but depending on the weather, depending on how hot it is out there, depending on how much we're expecting out of that animal, and depending on the types of feeds that we're feeding, all of those things can fluctuate somewhat. So if we think about, certainly the water needs to be, there's a requirement for water. Now we do supply some of the water in our feeds. And I think that's, when we think about that, that's something to remember as well. Most of the time we feed a lot of dry feeds. A lot of our mixed rations are dry for the most part. They'll contain a small percentage of water. But if we're out grazing lush green growth or green grass, rapidly growing grass can actually be pretty high in water. So if we were to turn out right now on some real lush green pasture right now, that green pasture would probably be about 75% water and about 25% plant material. So certainly we get water from our feed. Now that's not the only source that we need, but certainly we can get some water from that as well. All animals produce their own water just through metabolic processes as well. Now obviously that won't meet their requirements, but it contributes to the overall water balance for the animal as well. So those are all parts of it. But when we think about that animal's requirements for water, we need to factor in exactly how they're using that water or the importance of that water. So they lose water every day just through normal metabolic functions. That happens on a daily basis, and depending on how hot the weather is or based on their milk production. So heavy milking, whether it's goats or lambs or cows, depending on their milk production, increases their requirements pretty dramatically. As shown in the picture, dairy cattle, for example, if they're producing 40, 50 pounds of milk per day, that's predominantly water. They've got to replace that water in their own bodies as well. So that's important to think about as well. Stage of production is important for water as well. Okay, so what happens? This is a key thing to remember. Certainly water is important, we know, for healthy animals, but it's key if you're focusing on, for example, my daughter raises goats, and it's key to get those goats to a certain weight prior to fair. We know that's the case for lambs. We know that's the case for market steers, all of those things. So in many cases, our livestock projects need to have an adequate average daily gain, adequate weight gain every day to reach their target weights in time for fair. And probably the key thing that influences that is water intake. So having clean water, making sure it's available, has a big effect. One of the number one factors that shows that reduced performance is typically related to water. That's one of the key things when I work with ranchers around the state and working with producers. If they've got issues with performance in cattle, that's kind of one of the first places we'll start is water, and is there good quality water, and is it clean? So those things are pretty important. All right. So water is one of them. Probably the next key ingredient that we'll talk about today, and we'll focus ration balancing on, is protein. Now we know protein is really important, especially for growing animals, and balancing your diets for protein, pretty key. We know certainly as they grow, as they increase in weight, or if they produce milk, all of these types of things, protein is important because it helps develop muscle. It helps increase the size and mass of internal organs. They need it for skin, hair, feathers, horns, whatever we're growing. Those all have a high protein requirement, and so we have to have protein in our feed. And proteins are pretty key building blocks to that. Now, I trying to tie it in, how important it is, try and tie it back to our own diets. And if we think about what we need to eat ourselves for adequate protein, I like to think of steak. That's probably my favorite protein source. If I need protein, which I probably eat in excess of protein. But in general terms, that's what we think of when we think of feeds from a human diet standpoint, is having plenty of steak in our diet or some type of meat in our diet. Some of those are plant-based as well. So depending on what our preference is or what we like to eat, peanut butter is a good source of protein, all of these types of things. But proteins are a key. And so they're, again, a big part of that. How do we get our proteins in our diet? Most of the time, this is just an example for livestock feeds, but most of common sources of proteins in our feed that are high in protein are things like sunflower meal, fish meal, soybean meal, cottonseed meal. Sometimes we'll have dried milk extracts put in different feeds. Amino acids, sometimes we'll add individual ingredients, especially in swine diets and sometimes poultry diets. We'll add individual amino acids. But for the most part, if we're talking about livestock rations and livestock diets, we focus mainly on soybean meal, sunflower meal, cottonseed meal, these types of things. So they can be important parts of protein in our diet. And we'll come back to this in a minute. Basically, proteins are essentially compounds that are made up of amino acids. And we're probably familiar with amino acids. We talk about amino acids. We have basically 20 amino acids. In general, there are some, depending on the structure, there are basically 20 amino acids. And in many cases, those are the building blocks. So our bodies take amino acids and put amino acids together in many different forms to create all of our tissues. So amino acids are the building blocks for all of our tissues. And they're a protein from the standpoint of ration balancing. Protein is very important, and it's also probably one of the more expensive ingredients that we balance for. So if you price it out per protein or per pound of protein or per unit of protein, protein is pretty critical. It's important, and it's also probably one of the more expensive components of the rations that we put together. So as we mentioned, there's 20 basic amino acids. You can group those amino acids in a lot of different ways. You can group them by the types of structures, by their acidity, based on their polarity. We'd like to group those from a nutrition standpoint on whether they're essential amino acids or non-essential amino acids. And these are different depending on the type of livestock that we're dealing with. But non-essential amino acids are amino acids that are not critical necessarily. They're needed by the animals, but they're, the body can synthesize them themselves. So they do not have to be provided. The body can build them themselves. Ruminant animals, so cattle, sheep, and goats, have very few essential amino acids because the rumen bacteria produce a lot of the essential amino acids that we need. So we're not as concerned about amino acids, individual amino acids in ruminant diets, but they are critical in non-ruminant diets, so such as poultry or swine diets. So those essential amino acids in, say, swine or poultry diets are amino acids that animal cannot produce, or at least cannot produce enough of them on their own to be as productive as we would like, and they must be provided in the diet. So a lot of non-ruminants need quite a few of those amino acids provided in their diets. So for the main two amino acids that we like to balance for, especially in swine diets, are lysine and methionine, a couple of those amino acids, but they are essential, and we try and supply them by providing not only adequate protein in the diet, but sometimes a variety of proteins in the diet to try and cover all of those. So if you were to look at those proteins, and I'm kind of finishing up, I'm not going to dwell much longer on proteins, but if you were to dwell on and focus on those proteins, we group them into animal proteins and vegetable proteins. So we typically deal with in cattle diets and sheep and goat diets, we deal mainly with vegetable diets. We have a rule in the United States that we cannot feed animal byproducts, especially ruminant animal tissues or ruminant animal proteins, back to ruminant animals. So that's remember that was created for scrapie and those types of issues in sheep, scrapie in sheep, and BSE in cattle. So we don't feed a lot of animal proteins back to ruminant animals. However, non-ruminant animals, we do utilize animal proteins. So those are typically meat and bone meal, blood meal, those types of things. And in all honesty, probably animal proteins, if we were to balance on an amino acid standpoint, some of those animal proteins are pretty critical, especially for our non-ruminant species. It's important to consider those. All right, so let's think about carbohydrates. So we talked about water, we talked about protein. Carbohydrates are another important category that we need to think about, and that's probably where we get all of our energy, right? So carbohydrates are important for the energy part of that. It's the largest part of the animal's food supply, and usually, so not only energy, but a fibrous portion of the diet as well. So if we think about carbohydrates, for the most part, it can be sugars, it can be starches, can be cellulose. Typically, carbohydrates are made up of carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen. So when I think of carbohydrates, especially from a market animal project, from a human food standpoint, I tend to think of basically a candy bar. What can we eat that gets a lot of energy into that animal at a high level? So if we think about in our own diets, what are something that sometimes we eat in smaller amounts that are high in energy? That's like sugars, candies, those types of things that are high in energy. So carbohydrates kind of fall into that category. Again, so we typically think of carbohydrates as sugars and starches and fiber. That's basically what they show up in our livestock diets. So if we think about carbohydrates, again, they are, the available or the soluble carbohydrates are our sugars and starches. They're typically an immediate energy, and they typically come from cereal grains. So we think about getting a lot of that energy from our corn, wheat, barley, oats, these types of feeds. That's where we get all of our carbohydrates. Those are simple carbs that we think about. The other that are important more in a ruminant diet for cattle or sheep are carbohydrates that are known as complex carbohydrates or fibers. So that's kind of cellulose and lignin, those structural carbohydrates that we find in plants, and the fiber portion of that. Now, ruminant animals require a certain amount of fiber in their diet. We'll talk a little bit about that as we kind of talk about beef cattle diets later on, but they certainly require some fiber for a lot of different reasons. Ruminant microbes or the bacteria in the rumen require or utilize fiber in the diet. It's also important for rumen health. So the rumen wall, the rumen lining, needs some amount of fiber in it for the rumen lining to remain healthy. Now, in cattle diets, even in feedlot diets, we need some amount of fiber because we need that rumen wall, we need the rumen lining to remain healthy because that's where we do a lot of absorption. So if we get a diet that's too high in sugars, too high in starches, and too low in fiber, we can actually cause the animal to become less efficient, to utilize their feed less efficiently because we don't have a healthy rumen. So we do need some complex carbohydrates. We do need some structural carbohydrates in the diet as well. So when we think about balancing diets, a lot of times we'll want to, especially for cattle, for goats, for sheep. Now we can't focus. So especially during the growing phase or when we're trying to add weight to that animal, we do need some amount of fiber in the diet for a healthy weight gain in that animal. All right, so the next one we talked about water, proteins, carbohydrates. Now we need to think about fats. Fats are important mainly from, for several different reasons. It's certainly a concentrated source of energy. We like to include some level of, so in a lot of our diets, we typically see fats included as oils. So we'll have a lot of our, say our show feeds or our mixed feeds will have some amount of fats in there. Fats are important for a lot of different reasons. They provide a lot of vitamins that we normally can't get in other ways. So those are important from that standpoint. But they're also extremely high in energy. So fats are more than double the energy value of a carbohydrate. So it's a good way to get some additional energy into the diet. Now, we can't overfeed fats, especially in some cases. We can't feed too much because we'll cause some health issues if we go too high on it. But fats are important in every animal. Fats are found in every cell of the body, and they're certainly important. We like to have fats in the diet because it promotes healthy skin, promotes healthy hair growth, and those things are pretty important, especially in some of our livestock species where we focus on hair production and skin. So fats are important as well. When I think about fats in our own diet, we typically think of anything with oils, butter, cheese has a relatively high fat content. All of those types of things can have high fat contents, and again, they're very energy dense. All right, so they're essentially made up of the same chemical elements as carbohydrates. They're just packaged differently, and they're actually, as I said, over twice as nutrient dense as carbohydrates. So if we overfeed fats, we can overfeed any type of animal, right? But they're needed for providing energy. They're needed for providing fat-soluble vitamins. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the vitamin part of this, but they are important for providing those fat-soluble vitamins. And a certain number of our fatty amino acids or fatty acids come from those fat sources as well. All right, we're kind of winding down on the hit list here as far as important nutrients, but I think it's key to kind of set the framework for what we're wanting to do later on. But so 2 more left. So we've gone through 4. Now we've just got 2 more left. One of those would be minerals, right? So if we think about minerals, those are primarily what we find in bones, teeth, important for those aspects for healthy bone growth. We certainly need iron, which is a mineral, for proper oxygen carrying capacity in our blood. We need potassium for proper muscle function, especially our heart. We need potassium levels for that. We need calcium for proper muscle work, as well as proper nerve junctions as well. So all of our nerve junctions in between our neurons, those are all fired. All of that signal is fired by calcium. So we need calcium in our diet for proper nerve function as well as muscle function. Minerals are important as well. So we're always told that, when you eat make sure you eat all of your vegetables, make sure you get your iron, all your potassium from bananas, iron from any type of green leafy vegetables, spinach, broccoli, these types of things. We focus on getting our minerals that way. Sometimes we take a multivitamin, a mineral vitamin supplement. And cattle, typically we think about taking in some type of mineral supplement along with it. So a lot of times we'll feed free choice mineral to our livestock animals. We'll provide it in the pen with the animal or in where the animal's kept. And so they can get at that as well. Minerals are important. And when we think about minerals are inorganic substances. And that's highlighted in red because this is important to think about. So we talk about vitamins and minerals. What are the difference between vitamins and minerals? Well, basically the big difference is minerals are inorganic. They're essentially elemental compounds. They're inorganic substances that we need in small amounts, right? So minerals, they don't contain any carbon. So we need those minerals for proper tissue growth, proper bone growth, teeth, all of those types of things, as we mentioned. Really important for muscle and nervous activity. We need a good mineral program for reproduction. So we focus a lot on calcium and phosphorus. Phosphorus, especially for reproduction, is key. Potassium is important for muscle production. So minerals are key as well. We need our mineral program, especially for digestion of feed. A lot of our complete feeds or our show feeds that we see will be balanced for a majority of those. When we think about our minerals and focus on those, we typically divide them into 2 groups, and especially for livestock. We tend to focus on major minerals, what we call macro minerals, or the ones that are needed in larger amounts. And then we also have trace mineral or minerals that are needed in much smaller amounts. So we won't focus a lot on that. Again, we have a lot of macro minerals, minerals that we consume in larger amounts. The main three that we need to think about are calcium, phosphorus, and sodium. So most of the time, if we buy a complete feed or a show feed, those are balanced pretty adequately for us. We have all of those provided for us. But if we're developing or we're mixing our own feeds, we need to kind of at least keep those in mind. We won't go in tonight, so we'll kind of, some of the other classes, more of the feeds and feeding type of things, we'll talk about some of the issues of the importance of minerals and some of those types of things. But we know minerals are necessary, right? Common major minerals that are important for us are sodium, which is basically an ingredient in salt. So animals need to have salt provided to them as well. Calcium and phosphorus. Again, calcium is important for nervous function, for all of our neurons to fire correctly, and phosphorus is important as well, especially in lactating. Calcium and phosphorus, very important in lactating animals or animals producing milk. All right. So I won't go into a lot of it. Calcium, we talked a little bit about, important for bone development as well as nerve function. Phosphorus is important certainly for bone development as well. Phosphorus is a key part of appetite, and appetite for good feed intake, we need to make sure phosphorus is adequate. That's important as well. We'll focus on, so we'll move on here to vitamins, and then we'll finally get into a little bit of ration balancing for us as well. So when we think about vitamins, again, that's all of the different vitamins that are available. Kind of an interesting thing. So we have fat-soluble and water-soluble vitamins. All of the B vitamins, interestingly enough, are provided there. Now we have B1 through B12, but there's not 12 B vitamins. Kind of an interesting story based on that. But at one time in discovering what were essential vitamins for animals, they came up with a total of 12. They quickly discovered that there actually weren't 12 B vitamins, but they kept the numbering system. So the ones that are critical or the ones that are essential are listed on that slide. B vitamins are pretty important as well, and I just covered up my text in the slide. But again, minerals are, talk a little bit about trace minerals as well. Trace minerals are needed in small amounts. We typically don't balance a lot for trace minerals unless we have a specific problem. But a lot of times if we buy a mineral supplement of any kind, those trace minerals are provided in it, okay? All right, here's my vitamins. I got a slide out of order there. So vitamins, now we talked about minerals as being inorganic substances. Vitamins are organic substances that are required in small amounts, all right? So we won't spend a lot of time on those. Again, they are organic compounds, and they're needed for typical health and growth and maintenance and those types of things. So there are essentially fat-soluble vitamins, A, D, E, and K, and there are water-soluble vitamins, which are vitamin C and B complex vitamins. Now in ruminant animals, the rumen microbes produce all of the B vitamins for us. So those are not, so don't buy any, you don't have to buy a B vitamin supplement for your sheep or your cow or your goat. So those are provided by the rumen microbes that are in there already. We do like to make sure we have adequate fat-soluble vitamins, and most of the time, if we provide a balanced diet, most of those are in there. All right, so vitamin A, for example, is important for vision. We know how critical that is. A lot of times we have a lot of vitamin A in green leafy type vegetables or green forages. So if we're providing any type of green forage or any type of plant-based supplement, those are typically provided. Now, when we get into real high grain-based type of diets or very that are predominantly, especially any very white starch type of a diet. So barley is basically, it has very little vitamin A in it. Corn has very limited amounts of vitamin A. So if we feed a very, very high grain diet, then we can run into deficiency issues sometimes if it's really, really high in grain. Most of the time in our diets, we really run into that because we provide some type of forage along with our diets in there. Vitamin do need to be covered in non-ruminant animals, so they can be important for that as well. Vitamin D, typically it's important for bone development and growth. again, in a lot of cases, if we're provided adequate sunlight, we cover most of our vitamin D requirement as well. Vitamin E is important for muscle development. Vitamin E and selenium are certainly important from an immune standpoint as well. But again, that's why we provide fats in our diet. That's why we provide a lot of these types of things, is because those fat-soluble vitamins are important, especially in non-ruminant diets, okay? Vitamin K is important for clotting. We won't get into that again. That's more of a feeds and feeding type of a topic, but vitamins are important. All right, so now as we kind of set the stage as far as ration balancing and kind of what we want to do. We can kind of classify feeds as well. I think, and so when we talk about feeds in general, we focus on this. Now, I think about it more from my standpoint on beef cattle diets or ruminant diets. I think about them from this standpoint of roughages, concentrates, and supplements. So depending on the type of diet that we're producing, as I mentioned before, in a lot of cases with our ruminant animals, with cattle or sheep, at least if we're trying to get those animals to remain healthy and grow adequately, they need some level of roughage in the diet, some amount of fiber in the diet in order for their rumen to remain healthy. Sometimes we back off of those forages or those fibers as we get further into the finishing phase. But again, they are still important from a production standpoint. All right. So when we think about roughages, again, high in fiber, relatively low in digestible nutrients. So we're not going to typically really fatten an animal off of forages unless it's a very, very high quality forage. Most of the time we're relying on that forage to provide adequate fiber, adequate scratch factor, especially for our ruminant animals. Now, fiber in a non-ruminant diet really doesn't do much good, right? Because a non-ruminant animal really doesn't have the bacteria, that doesn't have the enzymes to break down fiber. That exists in our ruminant species, and that's why we utilize those with our ruminant animals. All right. Examples of roughages there, we'll talk about how important they are in a little bit later on. When we think about concentrates, they're typically pretty low in fiber, but that's where a lot of our carbohydrate comes from, our rapidly available carbohydrate. And so corn and cottonseed, barley, oats, those types of things. And then a lot of time we'll provide supplements, whether it's a high protein supplement or a mineral supplement or our vitamin supplement. All of those things are pretty important as well. Okay, so we're flying through this pretty fast. If you have any questions or want me to back up or mention anything, I'm happy to do that. Now we kind of set the stage. I want to talk a little bit about balancing for feed rations and kind of focus on the real topic for us tonight. So one way to think about a ration is essentially what that animal's requirement, what that animal's daily intake is on different feeds. So if it were us, we would have to write down, if I had to write down my ration for the day, I would have to put down what I ate for breakfast, what I ate for lunch, what I'm planning on eating for supper, and break that into categories and make sure I'm balancing for that. So if I were really good, if I were a human nutritionist, I would make sure everything is covered as far as making sure I've got adequate fruits, adequate grains in my diet, adequate vegetables, and adequate proteins. All of those ingredients hopefully will provide an adequate or a balanced diet for me from a nutrient standpoint. So we eat different things, trying to make sure all of the basic essential nutrients are being covered. So again, a ration is essentially what we're providing to that animal over a 24-hour or one-day period. And so we need to make sure not only that everything is adequate, but that everything is in relatively adequate or the proper proportion of each nutrient for that animal's needs for efficient utilization of that. All right. So if we were to balance a ration, most of the time, if I work with a feedlot or work with a producer or a rancher, and we try and balance rations, we want to certainly identify the needs of the animal. Now, we'll try and do that a little bit tonight, but again, a key component of that are making sure, and we'll go through an example with cattle. I didn't go through every species tonight, but I'll try and use an example. But certainly, if we're going to balance a ration, we need to make sure we know what that animal's requirements are. So that animal we're expecting, we need to determine how much gain we need per day for that animal, and then make sure we have an adequate ration that will supply that level of nutrients for that predicted or that amount of gain in that animal. Identify what feedstuffs we can use. In many cases, it may be a prepackaged feed, a textured feed that's already been bagged for us, that's already somewhat been balanced. Or we may be mixing our own ration. And if we do that, I've got just some examples to think about to make sure we're providing adequate amounts of all of those ingredients. So we need to identify what feedstuffs we're going to use, calculate how much of the feedstuff we need to use in the ration, and check that against that animal's needs. So we need to balance that ration based on his needs. So one of the ways we do it in rations is especially with forages, is we need some type of forage analysis. So if we use predominantly feed hay in our diet, it's kind of nice to know the quality and the nutrition provided in that hay. And I've got just an example of a grass hay sample, and we can send those samples off to a lab and then come back and get information back that tells us the level of protein in that ration. In this case, this is a teff grass that is about 9.8, almost 10% protein. It gives us an energy value, and it gives us our mineral breakdown, calcium and phosphorus, potassium and magnesium. So those things are typically reported in a feed, in a forage analysis if we send it into a lab. Most of the time, we can look on our bag of feed to get some idea of what we're buying. So if we're buying individual ingredients, or if we're buying a complete feed, we can certainly look on the feed tag and gives us some idea of what diets or what rations are in there. So for example, this is a show feed for beef cattle. It tells me that this is actually a supplement that's added in. It's a supplement, so it's fed in small amounts that's included in. It's meant to complement the existing diet. It's got 25% protein, 2% fat. It's got 11% fiber, and then a whole range of vitamins and minerals that are included in that to cover for that animal. So there are, so we can pull that information off of a feed tag as well. So that's one way we can get at that additional information. So here's another example. Here is another beef cattle feed, and it basically tells us on the feed tag if we're meeting that animal's, what we're providing. So in this case, this is a complete feed that has 12% protein, 3% fat, 17% fiber, on and on and on. So that's provided on the tag. And we'll talk a little bit about that. In general terms, in our diets, we typically start a little bit higher protein early when that animal is depositing more muscle tissue. And then we taper that off and feed a little bit less protein as that animal gets further along on the finishing phase, where we're depositing less fat and a little bit more, or less muscle tissue, a little more fat later on in the phase. So for example, so what if you don't have bagged feeds? What if you buy individual ingredients? How do you know you're feeding the correct amounts of those different feeds, right? So that's important to know, especially in a lot of cases with some of our livestock that we're growing, that we're raising. Sometimes we buy individual ingredients. We're not buying bagged feed, so we need to make sure we're providing adequate amounts of different things. It's important to kind of recognize and realize the different feeds that we have and how they are related to one another. So if we think about, typically the standard we compare everything to some extent is corn. So from an energy standpoint, if we set corn at number 100% as far as what that feed provides as far as energy, if corn's 100%, everything is relative to that. So for example, alfalfa may provide a little bit more protein, but it's slightly lower in energy. Barley is a little bit less than corn. As you can see, a lot of different things that are provided on there. And so we can compare it from that standpoint. So let's take an example. So we kind of have an idea of what we want to feed. And just for tonight's purposes, and because I'm maybe a little more familiar with beef cattle, we'll just use the beef cattle as an example and just kind of go through the thought processes as far as balancing a diet and providing adequate nutrition for maybe my market steer. So how do I know if my market calf is ready and is on track for the show? Am I providing enough feed for that animal? Well, we need to come up with what we think a market weight or a final weight for that animal is. So determined or based on the size of that animal, that's going to help determine what the eventual or what the final market weight of that, or the preferred market weight for that animal is. So one way we can get us at is trying to determine the frame size of the animal that we're dealing with. So from a steer standpoint, we look at hip height. So we measure our steer, and our steer right now, based on his age, he's at 48 inches as far as hip height. And so he's roughly 12 months old right now, 48 inches high. That's probably not where he's going to be eventually when he finishes, but that's where he's at right now. So we have to kind of decide, what frame size is that animal? So if we go look at the table, Beef Improvement Federation is where this table came from. And again, this isn't really critical, but this is helping me decide what's the final size or what's the frame size of my animal. I'm trying to come up with a final market weight for my animal, and I'm trying to figure out what his potential is. So I use this table here, and I kind of figure out that my steer is going to be about a frame score 5 when he's mature. So I know that a frame score 5 steer is going to be somewhere between 1,200 pounds to maybe 1,300 pounds when he's completely finished. So that's kind of my target. Now I kind of know where I want to be. So if he's marketed correctly at around yield grade 2 or whatever, that's kind of where I want to be. All right, so maybe to be safe, I decide I want my steer to be around 1,300 pounds. I know if I weigh him today, he weighs 990 pounds. So I have to determine, am I going to get there? What does it take from an average daily gain standpoint to get to where he needs to be? So I know he needs to gain, if he weighs 990 pounds right now, I need to get another 300 pounds on that steer before fair. I know I've got roughly 90 days to get there. So I know that his average daily gain needs to be somewhere around 3.5 pounds per day to get him to that point. All right, so we can do that. Certainly we need to estimate what that animal's performance, what it needs to be in order to get him there. So what should we feed our calf? So typically we think all of these ingredients are pretty important. So we know we get all of our energy from carbohydrates and fats. So we need to have a certain amount of fat in the diet to make sure we're getting good hair growth, good skin condition. We need to make sure we've got carbohydrates in the diet to provide adequate energy to achieve that 3.5 pounds per day. We know we need adequate protein, minerals, all of those things we need to know we have in the diet. All right. So we typically get that from grain. We certainly need some fiber in the diet. Fats and oils, soybean meal or cottonseed meal probably provide some amount of free choice salt and mineral in the program. Make sure we've got adequate water for that animal. And then we develop and balance the formulation or balance the diet. So we pick out what feeds we're going to use. In this case, we could use COB, which is corn, oats, and barley. We can buy that at the local feed elevator, or we can buy it bagged for us. We can use whatever feed we have. Typically, from a beef diet, we'd like to feed some amount of grass hay. Again, they need some level of fiber in the diet, some amount of scratch factor to keep the rumen healthy. And we're going to feed some additional supplement because we're concerned that we're not providing adequate protein supplement. So in beef diets, we know the overall ration needs to be somewhere between 12 and 13% protein. We're worried we may not get adequate protein through our COB and through our grass hay, so we're going to include a protein supplement as well. So we need to figure out how much a steer will eat. In most cases, we figure, well, based on his size, it's a percentage of his body weight. Typically, we figure around 2.5% of his body weight. So if we do that, we figure that animal's going to eat around 25 pounds per day. So we're there, 25 pounds per day. If we need to balance a ration, we need to figure out he needs some amount of roughage in the diet per day. So if we figure he needs about 20% roughage, that's 5 pounds of hay. We include that in there. And so we've got a finishing diet that needs to be, so we're feeding a protein supplement, in this case, around about a pound of protein supplement as well. So now we've got 1 pound of a protein supplement, that's about 4% of the ration. We've got grass hay, that's about 20% of the diet, that's about 5 pounds of the ration. And we know that the rest so that's 6 pounds right there. we know that we need about additional 19 pounds of that diet to come from our other sources, whether it's grain or corn, oats, and barley, that type of a thing. So we can balance a ration based on that to make sure we've got adequate, everything covered. We've got our roughage covered, we've got our protein supplement, our corn, oats, and barley in there as well. All right, so that's one way we can approach it as well. So if we're using other types of diets or other animals, we look at something else. We can balance a very simple way to make sure we're meeting adequate needs of that animal. And this is just a simple tool that I think everybody should kind of learn how to use. And that is what we call the Pearson square. So this is trying to balance a diet so we can find what that animal's requirements are, what we think they need to be from a percentage standpoint for all of our different animals, for our different species. Well, if we're feeding individual ingredients, we need to make sure that everything is covered and that we've got to get adequate amounts in there. So we use the Pearson square method to balance for a nutrient contents in there. So we need to know certainly the nutrient content of the feed stuff. So I'm going to go through an example. This is actually an example that you could use for your beef animal. We'll go through a swine example as well. And that kind of gives you an idea how much, if you're mixing individual ingredients, how you can balance a ration using individual ingredients. So for example, let's talk about a swine example or a pig example, first of all. So we're going to use a Pearson square to try and balance for the amount of protein in the diet to make sure we're providing adequate protein. So in this case, he knows he's got soybean meal. So he's got corn, which is about 8, almost 9% crude protein. And he has soybean meal, which is about 44, almost 45% protein. So he wants to produce a batch of feed for his swine project. He's going to mix up about 700 pounds of total feed. And so he wants to know how much corn and how much soybean meal do we mix together to mix the correct feed for his swine project. So he knows, based on recommendations, that he wants an overall ration that's about 12% crude protein. So this is for his swine diet. He wants it about 12% protein. We know that he has corn that has about 9% protein. So if we fed straight corn, we would not meet that animal's protein requirements. There's not enough protein in corn to meet the protein requirements for this pig or for the swine project. So we can't just feed corn. We got to have some additional protein coming from somewhere. And we have soybean meal available too. So we know our soybean meal is really high in protein. So we can get adequate protein from the soybean meal, but we got to decide how much soybean meal do we add to the corn to come close to feeding that requirement. Now remember, protein is probably our most expensive nutrient, so we really don't want to overfeed protein if we can help it. We'd like to provide it in the correct amounts to meet the animal's requirements, but we really don't want to overfeed it because in a lot of ways we'd be kind of wasting it to some extent if we overfed the protein. So we want to know what's the correct balance of corn and soybean meal in this swine diet to mix a 700-pound batch, right? So we're going to mix 700 pounds of feed. All right, so that's our key ingredients. So this is what's called a Pearson square. So we use this to come up with and balance. This is a very simple tool to balance for a ration. So we have 2 ingredients. We've got corn, that's 8.9% protein, and we've got soybean meal, that's 44.4% protein. And we know our overall diet needs to be 12% protein. So that's somewhere in between those 2 feeds. So based on the amounts of each of those, we can come up, or we can balance based on 12%. All right, so I got to take a drink of water. So this is how we use a Pearson square. So the first thing we do is we subtract diagonally. So we take 44.4% minus our 12%, which is the ration that we're trying to build. We want the overall ration to be 12%. So 44.4 minus 12, we get 32.4 parts. All right, so that goes, so we do that diagonally. So 44 minus 12 equals 32.4. So we got that half of it done. Now we do the other diagonal. We know that corn is 8.9%. We subtract 12, Now that gives us a negative number, but we really don't use negative numbers. We look at the absolute differences between those. So the absolute difference between 12 and 8.9 is 3.1. All right, so now we've got those two numbers. We've got 32.4 and 3.1. We add those two numbers together, so the total number of parts is 35.5. So that's over here on the right side of the Pearson square. We add the 32.4 and the 3.1, we get a total of 35.5. So that's, we're at step 4. Now we convert that and try and create percentages. So if you remember the top part of that equation, we had corn was 32.4. We divide that by the total parts, 35.5. So 32.4 divided by 35.5 is 0.913 or 91.3% corn, right? So that gives us the percent corn we have in our overall ration. And then the bottom part is our soybean meal. We had 3.1 parts soybean meal divided by our total amount, which is 35.5. So 3.1 divided by 35.5 gives us 8.7% soybean meal. So to get to that overall crude protein diet for that ration of 12%, we feed a majority of it corn because it's not, close to 9% protein. And in order to bump us up to that 12% protein diet, we need to add about 8.7% of soybean meal to that as well. So then you convert it back, so you multiply by the percentages to get the total amounts. So if you're mixing 700 pounds of total feed, you multiply that by that percentage, and you know that if you're mixing 700 total pounds, you need about 640 pounds of corn, 639 pounds of corn, and 61 pounds of soybean meal. So that combination gets you to the correct amount. Now you can work backwards to double check your amounts. And so if you add those up, 639.1 plus 60.9 should equal 700 total pounds of feed. Now you can do this backwards to see if you're providing the correct amount of protein, right? So now we've got the total amounts of feed. We can work backwards to double check ourselves to make sure we're where we need to be. All right, so now we're going to check our work. We're going to double check. We're going to work backwards to make sure we're feeding the correct amount of protein. So we know we're feeding this amount of corn, 639 pounds of corn. We know that it's 8.9% protein. So out of that total 639 pounds of corn, of that pile of corn, we know that that's 56.9 pounds of protein in that. So we can calculate how much protein is contributed by the corn. We can do the same equation and determine how much protein is provided by the soybean meal. We add the 56.9 together with the 27, and we get 56.9 pounds of crude protein coming from the corn, 27 pounds of protein coming from the soybean meal. That gives us basically 84 pounds of crude protein. 84 divided by our original 700 pounds of feed means we're right at 12% crude protein. So what we calculated is correct. And that's our way to double check that. Now we don't have to do that every time, but it is a way to double check to make sure we're providing the right amount of feed. So we double checked it. We've got the correct amount. Okay, so let's do another one right quick, just as an example, because you'll have to do a multiple choice question on your quiz as an example of a Pearson square. So I did a beef one as well, just to kind of give us an example, and this is maybe a little bit easier. So in this case, we've got someone else, Angela here, is balancing a diet, and this is for 1,000 pounds of heifer feed. And so she wants a feed that's going to complement her prairie hay. So she wants the grain mix or the feed mix to be about 14% crude protein, which would complement her hay. So we want the overall ration to be about 14% protein. She's going to feed protein pellets, so she can buy those from the local feed mill. Those protein pellets are 20% protein. And she can use corn that's 8.7% protein. So how much to get to that 14%, how much corn and pellets does she mix together to get to a 14% protein diet, right? So we do the Pearson square again, same thing that we did before. Our numbers change a little bit, but we kind of do the same calculation, right? So we've got two feeds that we can combine. We want those two combinations, or the combination of those two feeds, to come to 14% crude protein. So that's where we want to ultimately be. So how much protein pellet and how much corn do we feed to get to that 14% crude protein? So we do the diagonal deal again. Remember, 20 minus 14 equals 6 parts corn. And then we do the other diagonal, 8.7 minus 14. Now we only work in absolute differences. We don't use negatives. So the difference between 8.7 and 14 is 5.3. So these two numbers are a little closer together than the last example that we had. But so to create this feed, we've got 5.3 parts of pellets and 6.0 parts of corn for a total of 11.3. All right. So we can then take those numbers, 5.3 parts of pellets, 6.0 parts of corn, 11.3 total. We do the same calculation that we did last time. And so we determine how much corn we need. So we know that we need 6 parts corn divided by our 11.3 total parts. That gives us 50 or 0.531 or 53% corn. We do the same calculation on our pellets. So 5.3 divided by 11.3, we end up with 46.9% pellets. So to get to an overall ration protein level of 14%, we need 51.3% corn and 46.9% pellets. So if we're making it in 1,000-pound batches, that's a pretty easy calculation, right? So 500. So we need 1,000 pounds times that, 531 pounds of corn, 469 pounds of pellets. So it's almost it's 53% corn, 47% pellets, pretty close to half and half, almost there. But that gets us to a 14% overall crude protein diet. So we double check it. We can double check it again like we did before. But that gets us to that point as far as the amount of corn and pellets. So that's another example of a Pearson square that we could do to balance a ration. Now, a lot of times we'll buy complete feeds that are already balanced for us. And that's not, but there are times, especially if we're developing breeding animals or we're feeding animals at home, we don't have access to complete feeds or textured feeds like that. We can use pretty simple tools like this, a Pearson square. We can use kind of basic guidelines to make sure we balance and develop a ration that's going to meet that animal's requirements. So my concern typically is, in many cases, if we're feeding a grain and a forage, that we're not meeting that animal's protein requirements in a beef cattle or a ruminant animal standpoint. So a lot of times we need an additional protein source, and we can use something like this. We can use a Pearson square to help us make sure we're providing adequate protein in the diet for that animal. A pretty simple tool that works really well in a lot of different things. All right, so this was our answer. 531 pounds of corn, 469 pounds of pellets to make that 1,000-pound batch of feed. All right, so I'm winding down. I told Don earlier that I've got about a 40-minute attention span, and so if I wander much past an hour, I lose my own attention span. We've gone a little bit over that. We're a little bit over an hour. I did want to provide some time for some discussion or some additional questions, but I just kind of wanted to, certainly summarize. We talked about the 6 main nutrients that we need, that we typically balance for in diets. Those nutrients, again, are water, protein, carbohydrates, fats, vitamins, and minerals. So that's a key part of that, making sure those are provided adequately. You need to certainly know what your animal's needs are as far as what level of growth do you need in that animal, what level of performance. Make sure you feed according to those needs. Make sure you balance for those key nutrients. And again, we talked about meeting that animal's protein requirements, regardless of what species it is, meeting that animal's protein requirements, providing enough energy for whatever level of performance we're balancing for, and making sure we provide those adequate nutrients. From a mineral standpoint, the 3 key minerals that we think about are sodium, providing plenty of adequate salt to that animal, calcium, and phosphorus. Those are the three main macronutrients that we need to focus on and balance our macro minerals that we need to provide for that animal. All right. That's all the slides I have. I've got lots of other things. If we can open it up for any questions. Maybe I finished a little bit early, Dawn. I'll turn it back over to you to see if there's any questions or any discussion. I hope I covered what you wanted me to. I'm happy to answer any additional questions or talk about any additional things if I can. Again, I think this is a great program, and I'm happy to provide any additional input that I can to be beneficial.
So does anybody have questions for Dr. Paisley?
So like, let's say I was to like figure out a balanced ration for like a goat. Like, what would I have to look up to get my different calculations and stuff?
Yeah, so what we would need would be to come up with some recommendations as far as guidelines, as far as the amount of, so is this for a market goat or for a dairy goat?
How about both? But like, let's do like a dairy goat, since that's more interesting.
Okay, so there you have, and I can provide to the group later on. So what I didn't know how much time we would, and I didn't know what species to focus on tonight. But so there are recommendations you can look online. I can provide those materials to you that provide guidelines as far as the nutrients, especially energy and protein for that goat. So we would calculate so for a dairy goat, based on what we'd expect that dairy goat's milk production to be, we can then estimate what that animal's requirements are. So that would be an estimated amount of feed intake and the amount of protein required by that animal and the amount of energy. And then we could either look at the feed tag of the current feed that you're using to see if that's based on the amount of feed you're providing and the nutrients in that feed to see if it's meeting their requirements. Or we could also, if you're mixing feed, we would have to do a Pearson square similar to what we do. So we would probably balance something for a lactating goat. You would probably need something that's roughly 12% protein, maybe 13 depending on her level of production in a lactating goat. And then making sure we're providing enough energy to meet her milk production level. Now on a market goat standpoint, we probably want that goat, I would guess, probably to gain around 0.7 pounds per day. So you would need to know the weight of your goat currently, and then what your daily gain requirements for that goat would be. And then we have tables that you can look at and see how much protein and how much energy that goat would need based on his current weight and based on the level or the amount of gain you want that animal to gain per day. And then we make sure the feed is providing that. So we'd have to get you those, and I could do that. I could share it with Dawn, but we'd need those tables that would kind of give you guidelines as far as how much protein and energy to provide.
Okay. And then I got another quick question if no one else has any. So like, like when you're milking, your goat has your dairy animal has a peak and then it levels off. And so like you want to lay back a little bit and then so you can spike them up again. So like how do you calculate that type of stuff? Like what's like? So
you probably do that. Now I hate to admit, so my daughter shows dairy goats, but I'm not a good, or market goats. I'm not a good maybe dairy goat resource for you. I could probably find someone that would be a better resource on the dairy side. In fact, I know exactly who I would recommend on that. So I'll get that information to Dawn. I know exactly who I would contact. I've got a former graduate student that is crazy into dairy goat production. She would kind of give you some recommendations on how to do that. You'd probably do that through amounts of feed. So you could probably feed a similar diet, but you would just have to somewhat control the amount of feed you were delivering to get that additional spike. And I'll get that contact information for you. That's a good question. Very good question.
Okay, thank you.
Does anybody else have questions? Well, I'll just say two parts of this is that I think that what Dr. Paisley covered tonight is like a critical part of animal science, and oftentimes the one that people don't know. I don't know, there's many of us that just go out there and dump hay to grain or whatever it is to our animals, and if they look a little skinny, we add a little bit more, or whatever it is, and then we tend to doctor symptoms instead of maybe staying on it. And I think that Dr. Paisley probably would reiterate that nutrition is like one of the #1 factors that's going to be correlated to health in your animals as well. So hopefully what you guys got out of tonight is that there's really a rhyme and reason in what we should be feeding and what we shouldn't be feeding, and I think that's really important. I also think that many times within our 4-H program that we tend to go to feeding workshops that tell us how to feed our market animals specifically, and it doesn't really teach you how to balance a ration using the Pearson square. So I think that that's really good information that hopefully you guys can gain and use. With that, I will tell you that the offshoot of this is that you guys will need to get labs, and when you do your labs in relationship to the nutrition for this year, is this will be one that's maybe a little more challenging because your nutrition labs need to focus on the balancing the rations and not just a feeding workshop. And so just put that kind of in the back of your brain, and hopefully we can help you guys achieve that and get the labs connected to really what the focal point for nutrition this year is. So I guess thank you very much, Dr. Paisley. I think this is super helpful and a good guideline. We had just a couple people that came on after I gave my original spill, so I just do want to reiterate that a couple things are, well, let me, before I do this, is there any other final questions for Dr. Paisley? All right, if not, just to reiterate, you guys heard at the beginning, but if you are going to the intensive weekend, please get signed up. On the intensive weekend sign-up sheet, there is an option for you guys to list some of the things that you would like to have as labs during that weekend, and I'm thinking this might be one of those that maybe we need to have an actual hands-on lab too to work on and try to get that requirement for you guys. So that needs to be signed up ASAP. The positive about going to the intensive weekend this year is that we do have some funds to help cover the expense of the weekend. And so in order to get your 4 credits for the animal science, or if you only have 1 year left, you can get 2 credits if you go to the intensive weekend. So I just really do want to make sure that everybody understands that, is that really you're getting 1 credit based on each year of the program you're in, but then you also get a credit for going to the intensive weekend. So for example, if you have 1 year of 4-H age eligibility left, you can get 1 year for doing the lectures and the labs, and then you can get 1 credit for going to the intensive weekend. So the intensive weekend is super important. In order to get the full 4 credits, you will have to do that at some point in the program. So my plug to you is, if it fits into your schedule, I'd really suggest you go this year, as we can help cover the cost and the expense. In fact, there won't be pretty much any expense for you guys except for to get transported there and maybe a meal there on the way back. But so please go get signed up if you haven't done that. And then just to put on your calendars, I did have a question about calendaring, so I am going to give you those dates specifically. Is that May 2nd is the lecture with Caleb for the animal selection, and then on May 11th is the repro with Scott Lake, and then on May 15th is the lecture with Dr. Rory Means on the meat science one. Just an FYI, if you are on, there's a little bit with the time got a little shuffled there, so I do want to make sure you understand that on the May 2nd with Caleb, it is at 6:30. On the May 11th with Scott Lake, it is at 6, so it's a half an hour earlier that night. And then on May 15th, it's at 6:30 with Dr. Means. So if you guys can put those on your schedule. Obviously, if you can't make those, remember you can go back and watch the recording. So just a couple other things is that the quiz will go live tonight. So Dr. Paisley has submitted his quiz questions, and they will be in the YO Learn. And you can go in and get that quiz taken. And then if any of you guys are having trouble getting logged on and getting caught up on those quizzes or entering your labs, besides Tia, because I know she needs help because she's asked, and then Brooke also is one that was struggling a bit tonight. So I will absolutely get that, or help you if you need help. I'm not the best in the way I'll learn, and Jonathan's kind of the expert on our panel to make that happen, but we'll definitely get you some help with that. And then any other questions related to any of that stuff? Labs, anything? Okay, Dr. Paisley, I just had a note in the chat box is that the dairy goat information would be great to try to help increase the milk production as well. So we do have a couple kids in the class that are raising dairy goats. So if you can pass along that information, I'll get it out to them as well. So
I will. I'll email it to you, and then you can share it with the group. That'd be great.
okay, that sounds good. I missed that chat moment till just now when I went back and looked at that. So, okay, with that, thank you guys very, very much. Please holler if you have questions or need help. And thanks for being in the program. We're excited that it's going and we're moving along. And it is exciting that it's our first wrap of this, and I think it's going well. So thank you. You each have a good night then.